Hi, Ms. McCurley.
My name is Emily Buffalo. I'm an online speech, and this is my informative speech. In the summer after I graduated high school, I took a trip to a country in South Central Africa that changed a lot of things for me. It changed my perspective and my heart and the direction that my life was taking at the time. Before I left for Africa that first July, I looked up a lot of statistics and just to kind of get a general idea of the current situation of Zambia's economics, their politics, and the nation's health overall, and just kind of a general idea of their people. And whenever I got home, I realized that a lot of those statistics and those numbers on websites had become a lot more personal to me than they had been before I left. They had become people that I'd actually talked to and had a conversation with, and children that I'd actually walked around with and gotten to know and things like that. So, and having been to Zambia a couple of times in the last year, I've learned a little more each trip about the current situation. And ultimately, the overwhelming need in Zambia, which can be translated farther into ultimate need in Africa, I think is caused by a cycle of poverty, a cycle of disease, and and the consequences of just monetary aid and the lack of physical aid. There is an overwhelming amount of poverty in Zambia and in Africa alone. Poverty in Africa generally derives from lack of basic human needs like appropriate shelter, food, and not just food, but the type of food that they eat and then the amount of it, because a lot of them don't even have solid meals 3 times a day, and especially water. And despite Africa's wealthy amount of natural resources such as copper in Zambia, they have the largest copper reserve in the world. Despite all of their wealth and natural resources, a lot of their economic slowness is caused because of the corruption of their governments. And as of many countries in Africa, a lot of their governments are incredibly corrupt, and it makes it hard for them to have businesses jump-started, and it makes the government takes a lot of liberty in taking the citizens' liberties away. So it's really hard for them to get businesses started. In 2002, the UN classified several nations in Africa as having low human development. And just to kind of give some perspective, a lot of countries in 2009, their GDP per capita reached $200 for the entire year. And the US in 2013, their GDP per capita was $15.68 trillion. So there's just a little bit of perspective. The number of classified poor in 2011 in Zambia was 6,383,370, and their population peaks at about 14 million each year. So that's roughly about half their population is classified as poor. And the cycle really starts with the parents, and a lot of times in conditions that they can't control because they've been passed on from their parents. They're born into a family, and they're often orphaned very young, and then they have all their brothers and sisters to care for. And so it leaves a lot of them to fend for themselves, and it just puts an extremely heavy burden on many of their population's youth. Another very vicious cycle that is very rampant in Zambia and many parts of Africa is disease. The highest ranking diseases in Zambia is the spread of HIV and AIDS, malaria, and unsanitary drinking water. And a lot of these cycles are derived mainly from lack of education and lack of prevention. Zambia is classified as an epidemic country, having their adult population listed with a almost 25% infection rate, and that's not counting any of their children that are infected with HIV and AIDS, which that's passed on mainly through the mother. If the mother has HIV, the child is usually infected as well. The third disease, I guess that's really very severe in Zambia, is contaminated drinking water. Only 60% of their population has access to clean drinking water, and whenever I was there, a lot of the women would tell us that they would walk several miles to get a very small bucket of water, and it was usually a light brown color, and they often share their water with animals in the area, and etc., so full of disease. The last cycle that has really put Zambia in its current situation is kind of one that I think a lot of Western civilizations have a hard time understanding if you haven't been there yourself. But the idea and the consequences behind monetary aid, a lot of people who have done studies on Africa have kind of referred to it as the tragedy of aid. A lot of people in developed countries write big, tremendous checks to people and governments in parts of Africa, and they think that it's a really, really great thing, and it sometimes can be. But a lot of the times, the governments just take that money for themselves, and they benefit themselves and then the members of their like their immediate families and etc., and it never even reaches the citizens, so it really does no good. Monetary aid often encourages bad behaviors and does nothing to help the people who really need it. And physical aid, on the other hand, would be the better option, because that would be a group of people coming in that would genuinely have an interest and concern for these people, and who could actually implement habits and teaching them how to irrigate gardens, install wells, and etc. So in conclusion, the current state of Zambia has been caused by these cycles, and I think that they can all, just like the same way that HIV and AIDS and all these things I've talked about have had such a horrible ripple effect on this nation and several of the nations in Africa, I believe that the act of just stepping in with physical aid can probably prevent most of these, and providing children with a safe learning environment and an environment where they can get vaccines, they can grow up to be leaders who have that same ripple effect on their populations in the future.
Best speech ever.